Okay, let's move on. Looks like we have another hearing here, revocation, suspension, or amendment of a conditional use permit previously granted November 2013 to allow for additional food service at a bed and breakfast known as the Waller House Inn. The applicants are here. Ben, do you want to handle this one too?
Sure. You maybe know some of it, you know more about this than I do from back when it was approved last November, since I wasn't here at the time. But it was right after a change in the ordinance to address bed and breakfast and how they were going to be regulated and what was allowed and what wasn't. And there was basically two different categories of bed and breakfast. One was just the standard bed and breakfast. People sleep and they provide food for them. And then the second category is where you have a bed and breakfast with this what's called additional food service, where you could have outside groups come in and be provided with food and a meal and whatever it would be for that evening. So they were approved for both of those. And one of the conditions of that approval was that they have a parking plan that would be approved by staff, presumably based on the ordinance requirements. And so we met with them earlier this summer to kind of look on site about where they could put some parking, and they had submitted a plan. Sometime after that original meeting, they would have met the requirements for the parking, off-street parking for additional food service. As it stands now, they meet the parking for the regular bed and breakfast. We're not talking about the bed and breakfast itself. All we're talking about is this ability to bring in other outside groups for meals. And so to meet that parking requirement, they had to provide 9 spaces, I believe it was. And they've got about 4 or 5 or 6 right now, I believe. And so we talked about ways that they could meet that other requirement, and then they can speak for themselves. But long and short of it is, my understanding is they don't intend to put in those spaces. They don't have the financial, the cost of it is burdensome. So what happens in that case, we amended our ordinance relatively recently to kind of address these kinds of situations, to clarify how we handle it. And so what happens is we schedule a public hearing like this, and the options for the planning commission here is to recommend that that approval be rescinded, that it be amended in some manner, that it be deadline extended or something to meet the requirement. You have a fair amount of flexibility here to decide how you feel this should just best be handled. But again, they can speak for themselves. But my understanding is they don't have an intention of putting in spaces anytime in the near future. So obviously, I think extending the time frame is not going to make sense. So again, we're talking about rescinding or changing the approval that would allow for the additional food service. We're not talking about the bed and breakfast. They can continue. They met all those conditions to continue the bed and breakfast itself.
Okay, does the applicant have anything to say about this? Yes. Give your name and address.
My name is Raquel Lundberg. My address is 301 3rd Street, Southeast, Little Falls. In November of 2006, my husband Scott and I were interested in purchasing the Waller House Inn. The advertisement for the Waller House Inn stated that all the city and county permits and licenses were in place, but we wanted to be sure. So when we wrote our purchase agreement, we made it contingent on the city approving it as a B&B. When we went to the city to ask about licensing, and we were assured that all the licensing and permits were in place, so we proceeded with the purchase of the house. We took it in good faith that this was correct information, and we didn't ask for any additional documentation. After all, the Waller House Inn had previously been a bed and breakfast, and the previous owner had been on the zoning commission. We also met with the county health department to acquire licensing on that level. This license enabled us to operate a bed and breakfast in Morrison County and to serve teas, with the only limitation on tea parties being that we could not serve more than 10 guests at a time. When we opened our doors for business in May of 2007, the City of Little Falls issued us the forms we would use for submitting the required 3% lodging tax and also the 0.5% restaurant tax we collected when serving tea parties. We've been faithful in collecting these taxes and submitting them to the city, and I'd like to add that the city has also been faithful in cashing those checks. Both the mayor and the zoning administrator's wife came for tea at the Waller House Inn. They, like we, believed that we were fully within the city and county codes and ordinances. In the fall of 2011, after being in business for more than 4 years and struggling to make ends meet, we decided that in order to increase our revenue when B&B business was slow, we'd like to add additional food service to our offerings. We'd be open for lunch with very limited seating and hours of operation. Dinner parties would be by appointment only, so as not to interfere or overlap with our bed and breakfast business. At that time, I approached a member of the zoning commission to express our ideas and ask what needed to be done to make this happen. This gentleman did a little digging and discovered that we did not, in fact, as we had previously been told, have a conditional use permit to operate a bed and breakfast. In fact, a city ordinance did not even exist to allow for bed and breakfast in Little Falls. Since there wasn't an ordinance, we wrote a proposal to the city of Little Falls asking them to change the zoning so that we could continue to operate our bed and breakfast. In January of 2012, a public hearing was held in regard to changing the zoning. We had a lot of support from the community and the neighborhood, but the zoning commission didn't think it was a good idea to spot zone as it could cause problems in the future. And they made a recommendation to the council to decline our request. This was really scary for us because we had been operating under the assumption that all the legalities were in place. Everything we have and everything we own is tied up in the Waller House Inn. We were afraid that we were going to have to close our beloved inn, and we probably would lose it. The city council agreed that spot zoning was a bad idea, and they refused our request. However, a motion was made that the zoning commission drop an ordinance to allow for B&Bs in Little Falls and to enable us to do the things that we had requested in our proposal. And the motion passed unanimously. In the meantime, we would be allowed in good faith to continue operation of our bed and breakfast, but we were asked to discontinue serving teas. We complied with the city's request, and we removed all mention of tea parties from our website. Then we waited, and we waited, and we waited. Finally, a year and a half later, I approached the zoning administrator to ask about the progress being made on the city ordinance pertaining to bed and breakfasts. At that point, no progress had been made because the zoning commission was consumed and overwhelmed by a lawsuit against the city. But he assured me that it would be complete soon. In September of 2013, a year and 9 months after our initial public hearing, another public hearing was held to introduce the new city ordinance. We were unable to attend that meeting because my husband had a heart attack that day. And at the next city council meeting, City Ordinance 49, 6th Series, allowing bed and breakfast establishments in 1 and 2 family residential R1 zoning districts by conditional use was adopted upon the Planning Commission's recommendation. Shortly thereafter, we applied for and were granted a conditional use permit to operate a bed and breakfast with additional food service in Little Falls. This new ordinance allows for bed and breakfast in Little Falls, but it's not what we had asked for when we approached the city 2 years earlier. We had asked for permission to offer tea parties and lunches and dinners by appointment to the general public, and this was to fill in the gaps as our schedule allowed. What the new ordinance allowed was food service only between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. This leaves no room for serving dinners to the general public by appointment. It also restricts the hours that we're allowed to have tea parties. Before we asked for the changes, we used our discretion to serve teas to fill in the gaps when we didn't have B&B guests. The new ordinance demands that we add additional off-street parking to make a total of 9 parking spots. This parking issue is why we're here. We currently have enough off-street spots to accommodate all of our guest rooms at the B&B. On 2 separate occasions this year, we met with city staff, once this summer at the Waller House Inn to look at our parking area and assess the situation, and again this fall to discuss the ordinance. We believe that it's not reasonable to demand more off-street parking, and here's why. The ordinance states that we are not to serve food after 4 o'clock. The reason I believe the reason for this is that our bed and breakfast check-in hours are at 4 o'clock. And the ordinance doesn't allow for overlap between tea parties and overnight guests at the B&B. So tea parties are before 4, so everybody's gone. Guests check in after 4. And yet, it asks us to allow street parking to accommodate tea guests and B&B guests at the same time. Can't we use the same spots for different purposes at different times? There is no overlap. So, we came to the city in good faith 3 years ago, asking for permission to expand our offerings at the Waller House Inn. As a result, our ability to host tea parties was taken away for 2 years, and when we were again allowed to serve teas, our hours of operation were restricted. We still don't have the permission to host dinners by appointment. We wanted to be able to generate more revenue, and what we got were restrictions causing a loss in revenue. At this time, I'd like to petition the Planning Commission to revisit City Ordinance 49, 6th Series, and address the issues concerning the off-street parking. I'd also like to ask that you go back and read the original proposal that we set before you in January of 2012. We would be happy to work with the Planning Commission in introducing language into the city ordinance pertaining to bed and breakfasts that will be beneficial to the city of Little Falls, to ourselves, and to future innkeepers. We desire to continue to be an asset to this community. As of today, we have 54 reviews on TripAdvisor.com, and every one of them is a 5-star review. People love the Waller House Inn. And when they choose us, they choose Little Falls as a shopping, eating, and recreational destination as well. So we thank you for your support, and we thank you for your consideration. Should I stay here to answer any questions?
I think we understand it.
So,
Good. Thank you.
I do have one question. Do you
Yes.
have guests that would remain more than one night? Or is
Yeah.
it typically in and out?
It's typically in and out, but we do have some that would stay 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights. If we have a full house, we're not gonna book a dinner party. You know, we don't have that many hands.
I guess I'm just trying to, I'm still following your logic with parking,
Okay?
that if you have guests staying multiple nights, that
Mhm.
they would be occupying those parking spots, yes?
Yes,
During the daytime?
yes. However, the whole purpose of being able to do teas and lunches and dinners by appointment is to fill in the gaps. It's not to do it at the same time. You know, our rooms are scheduled and booked often way ahead of time, and all of our dinners, teas, lunches would be by appointment. So
How many rooms do you have?
we have 6 units.
So you could have up to 6 vehicles parked there
We
if-
could.
if you were full.
We could.
Okay.
And according to the ordinance pertaining to the additional food service, they want 1 parking spot for every 3 guests. And
Okay.
we max out at 10.
Yeah.
So that would be 3 parking spots. So if we have 3 parking spots full for, you know, dinner guests,
Yeah.
that
You'd have-
still leaves 3 if we have 3 rooms full.
Okay.
So,
So it looks to me like it's not so much a matter of total parking spots, is can you double purpose a parking spot? You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Because you have 6 parking spots already.
We do.
Okay.
And if we can't get around it, is this a really dumb question? What about offering a valet service to the courthouse? Is that public parking? I mean, you're a block away. Is that something we could look at, or is that just really?
We're a half a block from a business district. You know, I mean, there's
So
parking.
there's lots of
available.
parking on that street.
And we're on a corner, so there's street parking available on both sides. St. Mary's Church, 2 days, Saturday nights and Sunday mornings, you know, they're on the entire 2nd Avenue. Oftentimes the courthouse is down 3rd Street. They can use our street parking, but we can't, our guests can't, which doesn't really make sense either.
And I think the reason originally for that number though was the overnight parking of vehicles on the street.
Mhm.
Traffic
Right, and
congestion and
there's
stuff.
a place for them to park
Yeah.
off the street. Okay, thank you.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
What was your reasoning, why you feel you can't put in 3 more parking spots? It seems,
The first and foremost reason is that we believe it's not necessary. Secondly, we can't afford it. We'd have to tear down trees, you know, we'd lose one of our gardens, and it's just it's an expense. In 2014, our total revenue from tea sales was $1,500 total for the whole year, and the parking would cost, you know, it's not cost effective, $6,000-$7,000 to put in more parking. So.
does anyone else have something to say?
Yes, I do.
Name and address, please.
Robin Hensel, 807 First Street Southeast. Well spoken, and well done. First, I want to state that these are public streets, not private streets. I really believe that this city really needs to get on board with supporting in every way home businesses and not pitting a home business against the downtown business. That doesn't help anyone economically. It doesn't help the city bring in tourists, which obviously this well-run home does. They're in a real quandary, but there are some concerns I have. There are 6 rooms for rent, not 4, as stated in the public information packet about this, so there's a quandary right there. Can this property meet the 25% required green space if they make an additional 3 spaces? It looks like on the maps that I see that there really are only 4 spaces for public off-street parking, because 2 of the spaces on both the diagrams include your garage space, I think, if I'm seeing that correctly. If you change the city code, which I really think you should, and not require any off-street parking, I think you should do that. However, now Christian Andrews has had to comply with this same ordinance. So you've set a precedent. And I think you have a problem if you change the city ordinance now. If I were them, they have a legitimate beef. They just went to a huge expense to tear up trees and put in a blacktop, and so that they could do the required parking, and they're just a few houses from me. I hope the city makes the right decision to accommodate them. I hope we don't lose them as a revenue source in the city. They've worked really hard to grow a nice business, and I think there are just far too many ordinances, and I think this city has no way to afford continuing enforcing those ordinances or enforcing them fairly. And I think both have been a problem for the city and will continue to be going forward. So I honestly, you know, there are rental spaces in the downtown area of apartments above, and those owners of those apartments are not required to provide off-street parking. Why? But these folks are. That's just simply not fair. Thank you.
This public hearing was about them requesting to change the original conditional use permit. It wasn't about all the ordinance and everything. That would have to be brought up at a different date if that's something that the city council asks us to do. So we can't do anything about that, about the Christiansens and so forth. We're a group that we're set up here to read what's in place and then interpret it and go from there. At times, the city council asks us to take a look at ordinances, and then we have to do a lot of research, we get attorneys involved, we look at a lot of other communities, and then we bring it before a public hearing here, and then all we can do is give our suggestion to the city council, which they make the ultimate decision. It's not us. So we can't change that now or anything. All we can do is listen to what you want to do and act on your request right now. So that's what I suggest the planning commission to take into consideration now and decide. If there's no further discussion from the floor, I move to close this public hearing at 7:29. And then open up for discussion amongst the board. I closed it, yeah.
I was just thinking, the argument that you make for double purposing the parking, I think can carry a lot of weight. That makes sense to me. And if the extra hours, or the hours that you're looking most of the time when you're operating teas and contract dinners or by appointment, I don't see the problem in having customers use on-street parking for those. I mean, after all, we have restaurants in town that use on-street parking as well. I don't know that it would provide a congestion.
Well, I guess to me, this whole question boils down to 3 parking places. You know, is it worth losing a business over 3 parking places? No.
Again, our discussion is supposed to be focused on their request. We haven't opened this up if we're gonna change the ordinance or.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm not proposing changing the ordinance. I'm just saying that, you know, bottom line is, we're talking about 3 parking places.
So as far as giving permission to bypass or change that condition, that would be something that have to be brought up at a different date.
Oh, okay.
We have an amendment. It
Can amend
says,
their conditional use permit if we want to amend their restrictions we put on their conditional use.
Did they ask for an amendment, or was it to,
Revocation, suspension, or amend.
according to what Dan said earlier, it was they came in to ask to, they're not going to pursue this, open up for serving meals at different times because they don't want to add 3 parking spots and they can't afford it, right? So, or when financially, it wouldn't even be feasible. I mean, you'd lose money. So we're supposed to be acting upon what their request was. Can you restate that, Ben, so we all have the same understanding here?
Well, okay, so the condition, to go back to page 1, public hearing number 2-1. At the very bottom there, these are the listing of the conditions. And the first one there says parking must meet the requirements of the ordinance, basically, it says. And so then when you jump to ordinance, refer you to page 3, at the very top there. buildings with 2 or more uses, which I think you could argue is what's going on here. So unless it meets the definition of joint parking facilities, it essentially said you can't double count. Each use shall be calculated separately for determining the total lot number. So we can talk about how you interpret that section, but I think the problem with just sort of saying, well, instead of requiring 3 more off-street parking spaces, we're not going to make that requirement. That really would have to be done by a variance because the ordinance requires those 3 extra spaces. And the double counting, we can talk about that section and how to interpret it. If this section basically says you can't double count, then again, it would have to be a variance to vary from that. And so,
But aren't you saying, aren't they saying instead of? So it's, I mean, you're saying you'd probably use it, or this probably means what they're saying, but they're saying instead of. They have people staying overnight, they're not gonna have a tea. If they have a tea, they're not gonna have people staying overnight. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's not gonna happen at the same time.
Right.
Here it says, parking must meet the requirements of section 11.7 of this chapter. In addition, must provide off-street parking for all dining guests. We do provide off-street parking for all dining guests. And we provide off-street parking for, I don't think we're in violation. We do provide off-street parking for our overnight guests. Just not at the same time. Same spots, different time.
So under 4, what you're saying is that if we consider this a building with 2 or more uses, they would be within the regulation then? Or am I reading it wrong? Huh?
Well,
No, he's saying they're not doing it right.
well, okay, so, I mean, maybe that's the conversation they have here, is how you interpret it.
Exactly.
So, I'm not going to.
So was there, do you have the conditions we stuck on them at the beginning? Wasn't it they couldn't have both at the same time?
Yep.
If they have bed and breakfast, they can't have?
there's no
We're
way,
asking, was that an original condition, or?
Right, back, I thought we had that as a original condition, if they can't use the rooms for tea parties, then use them for bed and breakfast at the same time. That's what where the restrictions of 4 o'clock come into effect, is because the teas would be done before the bed and breakfast people would arrive.
So then it can't.
but yet, you were saying you can't make it if your guests have to leave, if the teas leave at 4 o'clock, generally you're not gonna get any business because it usually extends. So then.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying.
Do your teas usually run past 4 o'clock?
No,
Okay.
never.
They can't.
Okay. Okay.
If they did, we'd be in violation of our conditional use
Okay.
permit.
My misunderstanding.
Thank you.
Ms. Hensel brought up an important thing. We just had another gentleman come in and he required off-street parking. He went through a lot of expense. He's not providing meals. He's not doing teas or anything.
His conditional use permit is for bed and breakfast.
Just basically bed
Not
and
for
breakfast.
yeah. They
So
don't
he
have
would
the
have
additional.
had to been required to do that as you have. You have enough spots right now just for a bed and breakfast, okay? So there would be no hassle with him,
There's no people.
and there is no precedence because it was set for a bed and breakfast for him. In fact, I think he even mentioned he could have put another room in there, but he chose not to, which would have required another parking spot. Okay.
So I guess it looks like in here that, you know, meat parking, dining facilities would not be open to public, we're limited to residents, employees, and registered guests. Hours, appointment 8 to 4, and dining would be limited to 10 persons, so I guess we felt necessary to put it in there where they can't overlap, because according to this, it don't look like it's
Yeah,
laid out black and white, I guess, that they can't have both at the same time, but
Because if there is no overlapping, then, it's like you said, there would be no necessity for 3 more parking spots.
You're asking me if that's what I was saying?
That's what I'm asking them.
You know, I guess honestly, as I was preparing this, I hadn't thought about the double use, and so I haven't
Double
really
use, yeah.
read through it with that in mind.
Because like you stated, it is actually double use because when you're having meals, you're not having gas and vice versa.
Yeah. And those 4 conditions you just read, those are from the ordinance, not from the approval.
Okay.
The approval that night only had 2 conditions. The off-street parking be approved by city staff, and then the other building inspector. So those were the conditions of the approval. But these ordinance requirements apply regardless.
So we can add another, we can amend the conditional use to add the verbiage that they cannot overlap, right? As a restriction?
I think it already says that.
No, not necessarily, because what, if your bed and breakfast people stay 2 nights, and here you can have a tea from 8 to 4, so they stay overnight 1 night or 2 nights, and you could have a tea in the middle of the day.
But
Between
they're
the 2.
not there during the day, they're out.
Yeah, right, we know they're not there, but the possibility is there for, to call for the parking spot, I guess.
At the top of page 3 where it talks about the buildings with 2 or more uses.
Right.
I don't know, as I read that more, I think it's kind of silent on the issue of this double use. I don't know if that was probably what was, I don't know, you were all around more than I was at that time, with traffic, if you have thoughts on it at that time, but each use shall be calculated separately for determining off-street parking spaces required. I guess the calculated separately kind of pushes you in the direction of, you gotta have 9 spaces. But, you can start to make an argument maybe that that's where you guys get paid your big dollars, I guess.
So
Yeah, our big dollars.
Those
Yeah.
interpretations.
is it simplest to request a variance to that section to allow the double counting of the parking stalls with the condition that only so many rooms can be rented at a particular time to still fit in that 6 stalls? Does that make sense?
I don't know why we need to have that, because they keep saying either or, they're not gonna have both,
Right, but you have to put the restriction in there.
just in
They
case.
say they do, tomorrow they can go home and they can book both of them. You can't, there's nothing saying you can stop them. That's where you run into the issue. Not saying that they're gonna, but the next person that comes in, right,
Yeah.
The other aspect of this too is on page 4, in that table at the bottom where it talks about the required number of spaces for different types of uses. And this is obviously a bigger, larger table of the ordinance itself. I just pulled out the 2 that apply here. So the bed and breakfast talks about that, and incidentally there it talks about, well, not there, but somewhere else it talks about the garage being a place for parking spaces.
or if it's an owner occupant or whatever.
But for the restaurants, cafes, bars, taverns, and nightclubs, I mean, that would apply in a commercial zone as well as here in this case, in a residential zone. And so, this would require an ordinance change to make it clear that do we have a different standard for something like bed and breakfast, additional food service than we do for restaurants? At this point, I don't think we do. I mean, it's a cafe, I guess. It's the closest thing I can equate it to in the ordinance the way we have it now. I think your options are to either say they would need a variance to allow for the double use of the spots. It would be essentially a variance from the section that talks about the 2 uses in one building.
Back on page 3.
Right on page 3, top of page 3. So you either say it's a variance to that to allow for the double use of each space, or you would say no, this section is essentially interpreted to mean that you can use a double use. Or we say it really just requires an ordinance change, and at this point, there's nothing we can really do to accommodate this. And this, whatever you recommend, will be a recommendation to the city council.
Now, when you say a variance for the conditional use permit or a variance from the,
A variance from the ordinance.
okay.
So they,